The Witch of Blackwater Fen. The road to Blackwater Fen disappeared beneath fog long before Selwyn Marr reached the village itself. One moment the narrow path still wound clearly through the dead pines, and the next it dissolved into pale mist so dense that even the lantern hanging from his carriage seemed swallowed by it. The horse slowed uneasily. Somewhere beyond the reeds, water moved with a slow and unnatural rhythm, as though the marsh itself breathed in sleep. Selwyn had spent most of his life dismissing superstition. As a scholar of folklore and forgotten regional customs, he considered legends valuable only as reflections of human fear. Stories changed over generations. Fear exaggerated details. Isolation transformed ordinary events into mythology. That was the explanation he carried with him when he arrived at Blackwater Fen, seeking the truth behind a name that appeared repeatedly in obscure manuscripts across Europe. Morvain. Not a surname, not a title. A witch. The first mention he found dated back almost 3 centuries. The text described a woman living beside a drowned forest where ravens gathered upon dead trees in impossible numbers. Other records contradicted one another in nearly every detail except one. Wherever Morvain appeared, entire villages abandoned their churches and sealed their mirrors before nightfall. The village of Blackwater Fen seemed already half abandoned when Selwyn arrived. Crooked houses leaned beside narrow canals dark as ink. Moss covered the roofs. Iron wind chimes turned slowly above empty porches, producing faint metallic whispers in the fog. No lights glowed behind the windows. At the center of the village stood a stone inn with a faded sign depicting a heron standing in black water. Inside, the air smelled of peat smoke and damp wood. The innkeeper, a broad-shouldered woman named Celeste Vey, stared silently when Selwyn introduced himself. "You came looking for her," she said eventually. Selwyn removed his gloves slowly. "I came researching local history." "No," Celeste replied quietly. "You came looking for the witch." The words settled heavily between them. Selwyn attempted a polite smile. "And if I did?" The innkeeper glanced toward the frost-covered windows. "Then you should leave before sunset." Outside, a raven landed upon the signpost beyond the glass. Its feathers glistened dark blue beneath the fading light. Selwyn noticed Celeste watching the bird with visible unease. "She keeps them," the innkeeper whispered. "Ravens." Celeste nodded. "They watch the roads for her." That night, Selwyn remained awake in his narrow room above the inn, studying the copied passages from his journals. Wind moved across the marsh outside with long, mournful sounds that resembled distant voices. Then came the tapping. 3 slow knocks against the window. Selwyn looked up sharply. The raven sat upon the ledge outside, motionless except for its eyes. It stared directly at him. A strange sensation passed through him then, not fear exactly, but recognition, as though the bird had not come by chance, but with intention. The raven spread its wings and vanished into the fog. The next morning, despite repeated warnings from the villagers, Selwyn followed the marsh road north. Blackwater fens stretched endlessly beneath a pale gray sky. Dead reeds protruded from the water like skeletal fingers. Ancient cypress trees rose from the marsh, wrapped in hanging moss that swayed despite the still air. And everywhere ravens watched from the branches. Some remained silent. Others uttered low clicking sounds that resembled fragments of speech. Hours passed before Selwyn finally saw the house. It stood upon a narrow island of black earth surrounded by dark water. The structure resembled neither cottage nor manor entirely, but something between the two. Steep Gothic roofs rose above narrow windows framed in iron. The walls were built from dark stone, veined with pale roots. Countless charms hung beneath the eaves, feathers, silver bells, dried flowers tied with crimson thread. The ravens covered the roofline. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, yet none made a sound. Selwyn crossed the narrow wooden bridge leading toward the house. Before he reached the door, it opened. The woman standing inside seemed almost part of the shadows behind her. She wore a long black dress whose sleeves draped like folded wings. Silver symbols had been embroidered into the fabric so subtly they only appeared when candlelight touched them. Her hair fell in dark waves over her shoulders, streaked faintly with white despite her otherwise ageless appearance. Most unsettling were her eyes, not because they appeared unnatural, but because they held the stillness of someone who had already witnessed too many centuries to be surprised by anything. "You followed them," she said softly. Her voice carried neither warmth nor hostility. "The ravens. They seldom bring strangers." Selwyn straightened carefully. "You are Morvain?" A faint smile touched her lips. "That is the name your kind prefers." Inside, the house was larger than its exterior suggested. Long corridors curved at impossible angles beneath dark wooden beams. Shelves lined every wall, filled with books bound in leather, faded nearly white with age. Strange herbs hung drying beside narrow windows. Candlelight flickered constantly despite the absence of wind. The ravens moved freely throughout the house. Some perched upon chandeliers, others rested along staircases or watched silently from open doorways. None appeared ordinary. One possessed silver markings beneath its wings, another had pale eyes instead of black. "You practice witchcraft," Selwyn said carefully as Morvain poured dark tea into iron cups. She looked amused by the phrase. "Your century enjoys dramatic words." "And what word would you use?" "Listening." Selwyn frowned slightly. "To what?" "The marsh, the dead, the things hidden beneath memory. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the fen, though the sky remained clear. Morvain led him eventually into a chamber unlike the others. The ceiling rose into a pointed vault supported by black wooden arches. Symbols had been painted across the floor in silver ash. At the center stood a circular basin filled with perfectly still water. Ravens surrounded it silently. This place existed long before the house, Morvain said. The fen was sacred once. To whom? She touched the edge of the basin lightly. To women your histories erased. The water shifted. Not from movement. From images. Selwyn stared as reflections appeared upon the dark surface. Ancient gatherings beside fires, hooded figures standing among standing stones, ravens circling above candlelit rituals beneath winter skies. "These are illusions," he whispered. "No," Morvain replied. "Memories." The chamber suddenly felt colder. Selwyn noticed then that the ravens had all turned toward him simultaneously, every black eye fixed upon him. "They know things about you," Morvain said quietly. "What things?" "The truths you avoid." The basin darkened further. Another image formed. Selwyn saw himself seated alone beside a hospital bed years earlier, unable to speak as someone died, listening for words he never managed to say. His breath caught sharply. "How did you—" "The fen remembers sorrow," Morvain interrupted softly. "Ravens carry what people try to bury." Selwyn stepped back from the basin. "You're manipulating me." "Am I?" The shadows in the chamber seemed deeper now. Outside the vaulted windows, ravens beat their wings against the darkening sky. For the first time since arriving at Blackwater Fen, genuine fear settled into Selwyn's chest. Not fear of violence, fear of exposure. Over the following days, Selwyn remained at the house despite every instinct telling him to leave. Something about Morvain's presence exerted a strange pull upon perception itself. Time blurred near her. Dreams became difficult to distinguish from waking moments. He began hearing whispers within the walls after midnight, not threatening voices, murmured names, forgotten names. Sometimes he woke to find ravens standing beside the bed, watching him silently. Yet Morvain herself remained composed and distant. She spent hours walking through the marsh, carrying lanterns whose pale flames burned blue against the fog. Ravens followed her in enormous spiraling flocks above the water. One evening, Selwyn finally asked the question haunting him since his arrival. "Are you truly immortal?" Morvain stood beside the narrow window overlooking the fen. "No one is immortal," she answered. "Some merely linger longer than they should." "You've lived for centuries." "Yes." "How?" The witch turned slowly toward him. There are places where memory becomes stronger than death. Lightning flashed far across the marsh. For a moment, the ravens outside appeared as moving shadows against silver fog. The fen feeds upon grief, Morvain continued. It preserves what refuses to disappear. And you're bound to it. Her silence confirmed more than words. That night the storm finally arrived. Rain lashed against the windows while wind howled across the marshlands with almost human voices. Ravens circled endlessly above the house despite the violent weather. Near midnight, Morvain led Selwyn outside carrying a lantern. "The fen is waking," she said. The marsh looked transformed beneath the storm. Dark water rippled unnaturally. Shapes moved beneath its surface. The dead trees swayed though the wind had momentarily ceased. Morvain stopped near a circle of half-submerged stones rising from the black water. "This is where they drowned us," she said quietly. Selwyn felt cold rain running down his face. "Who?" "The women who listened too closely." Ravens gathered along the stones around them, hundreds of them. Their cries echoed across the fen like a funeral chorus. Then Selwyn saw them, figures beneath the water, not bodies, reflections. Dozens of pale silhouettes drifting slowly below the surface as though suspended in endless sleep. The witch raised her lantern. "They remain because no one remembered their names," she whispered. The ravens erupted suddenly into the air. Their wings filled the storm-dark sky. And for one terrible moment, Selwyn understood what Morvain truly was. Not merely a witch, a keeper, the last guardian of every forgotten woman buried beneath the fen. The storm began fading before dawn. By morning, the marsh had returned to silence. Selwyn left Blackwater Fen that same day. The villagers watched him depart without speaking. Yet even now, years later, he cannot entirely escape the memory of Morvain or the endless marshlands surrounding her house. Sometimes, during storms, ravens gather upon the roof of his apartment, though he lives far from any wilderness. And occasionally he wakes before dawn, certain he hears a woman's voice whispering from somewhere beyond the darkness. Some memories never drown.